And please pray with me. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations in each one of our hearts be acceptable to you. O Lord, for you are our rock, and you are our Redeemer. Amen. I'm not even sure I need to preach all that much after that gospel story. It kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it? I'm just going to say a few extra words about it, but this is not going to be, I hope, a very long sermon. Instead, I truly ask you to go home and to reread this story one more time and think if there is one thing that it is calling you to do or to believe in this week ahead. This is a story that really speaks into our lives so powerfully. As a parent, I'm a parent of a 7- and 6-year-old. I spend a fair amount of time teaching our children the difference between right and wrong. We want them to be good people. I always say we want to raise kids who are kind and happy. We want them to be good as opposed to bad, generous as opposed to selfish, thoughtful as opposed to unthinking, and kind-hearted as opposed to cruel. We want them to know Jesus and to grow in the faith. We want them to rely on their religious practices for their whole life so that they will live a life that is righteous and beautiful, a reflection of God's love into this world. And I have a feeling that the Pharisees wanted the same thing. Those Pharisees who get such a bad rap throughout the scriptures. They had to have wanted their communities and their next generations to be able to reflect God's wisdom and God's righteousness, God's goodness into the world. They inherited an awful lot of rules and an awful lot of traditions, rituals, and some people might call it religious baggage about how to be formed correctly in the faith. And they had some pretty good ideas, some scripturally sound ideas about what makes a good life, a holy life, a life that is pleasing to God. And so I have a lot of sympathy for the Pharisees and for all the people who were there this day, this Sabbath day, this day in which we were supposed to rest and worship instead of go about doing work. I have sympathy for people that were there that day and heard that something happened and had no idea how to fit it in to their ideas of right and wrong, good and bad. I think it's fair to say that in my 15 years as a pastor, I've been asked a couple of questions very often. One of them I preached on a few months ago, the question of what happens after we die. But another question, and this might be the question that I actually get the most, I haven't kept track, but a question that comes up over and over again inside and outside of church. Do you know what it is? Take a little guess in your mind what question I am sure is in at least the top 5. What am I supposed to do with beggars? What am I supposed to do with beggars? I think this question comes up a lot because it's something we encounter in our lives, perhaps on a daily basis, driving around. I know when I get off 495 onto Gallows Road exit, there's almost always someone standing there asking for money. Probably all of us have in our daily or weekly commutes some intersection, some crossroads, some sidewalk, some church door we pass, and we know reliably we will encounter somebody who needs money. What are we supposed to do? Jesus, in this gospel lesson, is walking with his disciples on a day that is supposed to be a day in which nobody does any work at all. And yet here is this man begging. First of all, it's a reminder that for people who live in extreme poverty, for people who live on the outside of the norms and the ways that society can keep us safe and healthy, there's never a day off. Beggars were allowed to beg on the Sabbath, even if you weren't supposed to be working. When we encounter beggars, I think we tend to do what those disciples did, which is to realize there's something wrong with the world, and then to try to think about it. They walk by this beggar and they say to Jesus, "Now, how did that happen?" And Jesus does this beautiful thing, which he kind of says, "I think you might be asking the wrong question." And here is at the heart of everything that unfolds as the rest of this story takes place. What question do we ask? The question, what should I do when I meet someone begging on the road, is a great question. I'm not criticizing that question at all. It leads us into other questions, however. And if we say, what should I do when I meet someone begging on the road, and remove ourselves from that situation, we've done the opposite of what Jesus invites us into. Instead, I think we need to ask that question every time we encounter someone and let it work on us. And then ask the next question and the next question. And I think that what we find is that instead of asking what is the right thing to do in this situation, which was the question of the Pharisees, which is the question that each of us ultimately finds ourselves asking as we go about this world, instead of asking the questions of right and wrong, we ask other questions. What questions could replace what is the right thing to do? I really want to know. What questions could replace this? How do I show God's love? How do I show God's love? That's a great question. That seems more along the line the question Jesus asked, right, when he sees this blind man. Not who sinned, but how could God's love become present to this person? And that cracks us open. In the case of the beggar, it cracks us open from having to figure out, do I give this person $1 or do I not? Is $1 enough? What if I open a wallet and they see there's a 20 in there and I've only given them $1? What if I give them a granola bar but they don't actually want a granola bar, right? How can I show this person's God's love? What's another question? What's another question that we could ask? Somebody be, yeah, huh? What would Jesus do right now? What would Jesus do right now? Jesus certainly passed a lot of blind men that he did not heal. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Jesus didn't heal every single person he encountered. But he did heal some of them, and he empowered his disciples to heal in his name as well. To take on as part of our ministry as disciples of Jesus, the healing ministries, which is not only physical healing, but also emotional and religious healing. One of the things that's really important in this story is that the blind man ends up getting kicked out of God's community, and it's outside of that community that Jesus comes to him again, and they form a new community. One of the things that Jesus does is forms community among people that don't know that they belong to God. One more question, one more alternative question. Come on, church. Is anybody chatting? What is a good question that we could ask when faced with a beggar? A question besides what is the right or wrong thing to do here? What's your story? What's your story? Now imagine if you did that. I immediately have all sorts of worst case scenarios that come to mind. I gotta say, when you said that, I thought, oh, this person is going to be suffering from such a mental illness that I won't be able to have a conversation with them, or I'm at a red light and it's gonna turn green and I'm not gonna, right? But what if we said, I know I'm gonna encounter somebody today. I'm gonna take a minute and find out what is their story, and just open that up a little bit. That's a great question. Anybody have something burning out there that they want to share? This gospel story reveals to us just what is problematic about being religious people. And it's that we, as much as anybody else, can get locked in our own systems of right and wrong and move within them so good-heartedly that we forget to remember that God is working in other places and other ways too. I would never want to objectify the beggar on the street, the person that we pass, especially because I think what Jesus does here is sees that man, that blind man, not as an object lesson, but as a person to be encountered. But I do think that every time we meet somebody who makes us think and makes us wonder about why the world is in a certain way, we can see it as God getting our attention. And one of the questions I think we can ask every time we encounter someone who disturbs our sense of how the world should work is to ask ourselves, what is God doing here? This is one of the reasons I love the Message version of this gospel. And although I read a very long reading before, I'm going to read just a little bit of it to close my sermon. This is from verses 3 and 4. You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There's no such cause-effect here. Look instead for what God can do. And I truly believe that as we encounter places and people that disturb our peace, and we ask the question, what can God do here? It will open us up to the pathways of peace. Thanks be to God. Amen.